Hey guys, tonight we're wading into the marshy, gun-smoke shallows of Ocracoke Inlet, where on a grey November morning in 1718, the Royal Navy finally caught up with the most feared pirate in the Atlantic. But almost nothing about how it actually happened is what you've been told. Forget cannon broadsides and a man of war bearing down under full sail. The real story runs through two borrowed sloops, stripped down to almost nothing. A Virginia governor operating well outside his own colony's jurisdiction, a corrupt customs officer with pirate silver hidden under his floorboards, and a lieutenant who won the fight by playing dead. Somewhere in the middle of it sits a £100 sterling bounty, a wrecked flagship that betrayed its own captain months before the Navy ever set sail, and a severed head swinging from a bowsprit as it sailed home to Virginia. Welcome to Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina, 308 years ago, and a long way from anything resembling comfort. Go ahead and dim the lights, and if you've got a fan nearby, let it hum low in the corner, something steady and a little salty, like wind working through rigging in the dark. You're warm right now, you're dry. The most dangerous thing near you tonight is probably a phone charger. That won't be true where we're going. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sloop Adventure was taking on water fast, and the man standing on her deck in the grey half-light of June 1718 had every reason to believe his own flagship had just betrayed him. Timbers groaned somewhere below the waterline. Men shouted from the Queen Anne's Revenge, a few hundred yards off, as her hull settled sideways into a sandbar off Topsail Inlet, on the coast of what is now North Carolina, her 40 guns suddenly useless, tilting toward a sea that had, moments before, been entirely survivable. A second vessel had come in behind her to help, and promptly run aground too, as though the shoal had been waiting specifically for pirates. Within an hour, 2 ships were lost. Within a day, roughly 24 men would be marooned on a spit of sand, with no supplies and a slim chance of rescue. And the man in charge of all of it, a broad-shouldered Englishman with a beard famous enough that sailors from Boston to Barbados could describe it from memory, was, depending on which historian you ask, either the unluckiest navigator in the Atlantic or about to pull off the single greatest inside job of his career. Before she was Blackbeard's flagship, before she carried 40 guns and a crew north of 200 men, the ship now grinding into that sandbar had a very different life, and a considerably darker one. She began as La Concorde, a French vessel built for the slave trade, roughly 200 tons, and in November of 1717 she was 6 weeks out from West Africa, bound for Martinique. Off that island, 3 pirate vessels under Blackbeard's command intercepted her. La Concorde's crew, weakened by scurvy and outnumbered, surrendered without a fight, according to depositions later taken from her captain, a man named Pierre Dosset. It was in every practical sense a bloodless capture, the kind of anticlimactic surrender that never makes it into the legend, because a fight that ends before it starts doesn't sell many ballads. Here's the detail almost every retelling of this story quietly skips past, and it shouldn't be skipped. La Concorde, at the moment of her capture, carried somewhere between 450 and 550 enslaved Africans chained below her decks. The ship's own French owners in Nantes recorded slightly different counts, which tells you something about how carefully anyone involved was actually counting human cargo at the time. Blackbeard released most of these captives onto a smaller vessel and put them ashore, and it's worth being precise about why. Not mercy, historians are careful to stress, but simple economics. A fast, heavily armed slaving ship was worth infinitely more to a pirate than the cargo it happened to be carrying, and an idle human cargo that couldn't crew a ship or fight a battle was, from Blackbeard's ledger, dead weight. A little under 100 of the captives, by some accounts, were kept aboard and forced into pirate service instead, sharing decks and danger with men who'd only weeks earlier been prepared to sell them. It's an uncomfortable footnote inside a much larger legend, and one this story isn't going to smooth over just because the rest of the tale is more fun without it. Blackbeard renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that, on its own, tells you something about where his politics sat, invoking a monarch who died 4 years earlier and whose war against France and Spain had briefly made privateering a legal, even patriotic career path for men exactly like him. He spent weeks refitting her, adding cannon until she carried somewhere around 40 guns, more firepower than most of the small colonial forts she'd go on to threaten. Here's the thing about a 40-gun ship in 1717. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a recruiting poster. Word of a heavily armed pirate flagship spread through Caribbean ports faster than any newspaper could have managed, and men who might have hesitated to sign onto a leaky 10-gun sloop lined up to put their mark on the articles of a floating fortress. By early 1718, Blackbeard commanded a small flotilla and a crew that, at its peak, numbered somewhere close to 300 men across several vessels, an enormous force for a single captain to hold together, and, as it would turn out, far more men than he actually wanted to keep paying. Running a crew of that size wasn't simply a matter of firepower, it required a functioning system of government, of sorts, and pirate crews of this era genuinely had one. Before setting sail, most crews drew up a written set of articles, rules governing discipline, the division of plunder into shares, compensation scales for men who lost an eye or a limb in battle, and, this is the part worth sitting with, a vote. The captain of a pirate ship, unlike almost any other maritime commander of the era, generally held his position by the consent of his crew and could, in theory, be voted out if he mismanaged the ship or hoarded plunder unfairly. It's an odd kind of democracy to find aboard a vessel built entirely around theft and violence, but it's real, and it's documented across dozens of surviving articles from ships of this period. A pirate crew, for all its danger and coercion, often had more formal say over its own leadership than an ordinary sailor serving the Royal Navy or a merchant company ever did. Keep that in mind. It's going to matter more than you'd expect before this story is finished. His reputation by this point had outgrown the man. Contemporary accounts, a mix of newspaper reports out of Boston and Williamsburg, and later, dramatized retellings from Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, a book historians treat with real caution because its author's identity is still disputed and its details are known to have been embellished, describe a tall man with a black beard, grown long and wild, sometimes tied into small plaits, and, according to that same legendary account, occasionally worked through with slow-burning hemp cord or matches, so that in a boarding action his face appeared wreathed in smoke, like something risen out of the ship's own gunfire. Whether that detail is literal truth or the 18th century equivalent of a horror movie trailer is genuinely unresolved. What is documented from multiple independent witnesses across several separate incidents is that Blackbeard understood theatre as a weapon. He rarely needed to fire a shot. Most merchant crews surrendered the moment they recognized his flag and his silhouette, which meant that reputation alone was doing more work for him than his 40 guns combined, the pirate equivalent of a home field advantage nobody could legislate away. In May of 1718, that reputation reached its loudest, strangest peak. Blackbeard sailed his flotilla into the harbour at Charleston, South Carolina, and blockaded the port outright. Not a raid, not a chase, but an actual siege of a colonial capital by a private citizen with no government behind him. Over roughly a week, he stopped incoming and outgoing ships, took hostages including a member of the colony's governing council, a man named Samuel Wragg, and made a demand that still reads as almost comically specific. Not gold, not a ransom in coin, but a chest of medicine. Charleston, cut off and humiliated, delivered it. Historians still debate exactly what the medical demand tells us. Some read it as evidence of an outbreak of a specific illness, possibly syphilis, moving through his crew. Others simply note that whatever the cause, an entire port city bent to a pirate's will over a supply request, which says a great deal about the leverage a single feared captain could hold over an entire regional economy in 1718. It was, by any measure, the high watermark of Blackbeard's career. He would never again command that much force, that much fear, or that much leverage over a colonial government, and within a month most of it would be gone by his own hand. Here's what happened next, and here's where the story stops looking like triumph and starts looking like something closer to a con. Sailing north from Charleston with his flotilla, Blackbeard brought the Queen Anne's Revenge and a second sloop into Topsail Inlet, known today as Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, supposedly to careen the ships, a routine but essential maintenance process where a vessel is tipped on its side in shallow water so barnacles and worm-eaten wood can be scraped and repaired before they compromise the hull. Careening was dangerous under the best conditions, since a beached ship is a helpless one, and in this case, both vessels ran hard aground on a sandbar and were lost entirely. For a captain famous for having sailed treacherous coastal waters from the Caribbean to the Carolinas without serious incident, running not one but two ships aground in the same afternoon strains, coincidence passed its breaking point. We don't have to take this story only from official reports either. A local fisherman working the shoals near Topsail Inlet that week, his name isn't preserved in any surviving record, only his account, relayed second-hand through colonial correspondence describing the wreck to nearby settlers, reportedly described watching the second sloop come about to assist the stricken flagship and simply drive itself onto the same bar, as if her own pilot had steered deliberately for the shallowest water available rather than around it. Word like that moved through small coastal communities fast, carried house to house long before any government official ever wrote it down, and by the time colonial authorities began asking formal questions months later, the story of two ships wrecking in a single afternoon had already hardened into local rumor. Not an accident, most people nearby seemed to believe, but a captain quietly rigging his own shipwreck. Most historians who've studied the wreck site and the surviving testimony now lean toward exactly that reading, deliberate sabotage rather than bad luck. And the theory goes like this: Blackbeard's flotilla, at that point, was carrying somewhere close to 300 men and a finite amount of plunder, which meant an uncomfortably small individual share once everything was divided under the articles his crews had signed. A smaller crew on a faster, more maneuverable sloop meant a dramatically larger cut for whoever remained aboard, and, not incidentally, meant Blackbeard himself no longer had to command or feed an unwieldy pirate armada that had become more liability than asset. It's worth being fair to the other side of the argument too, since the record here is genuinely disputed rather than settled. Topsail Inlet's channels were notoriously shallow and shifting even for experienced local pilots, and colonial shipwrecks of exactly this kind happened often enough, for entirely mundane reasons, that he simply misjudged the water can't be ruled out with total confidence. What tips the balance for most historians isn't any single piece of evidence, but the pattern that followed the wreck almost immediately, a pattern that looks a great deal less like grief over a lost flagship and a great deal more like a plan already in motion. So he grounded the flagship and grounded the escort sloop sent to help her, and in the chaos that followed, quietly selected a smaller crew of his most trusted men to take aboard a third vessel, a sloop also confusingly named Adventure, while somewhere between 20 and 25 men were left behind on a nearby island with no food, no ship, and, according to the account later given by one of the men who survived it, precious little hope of rescue. A pirate named Israel Hands, who we'll meet properly later in this story, was among those kept aboard rather than marooned. Evidence, historians argue, that the split wasn't random but carefully engineered around loyalty and usefulness. We know some of this not from Blackbeard's own account, which naturally doesn't exist, but from later depositions and testimony given by surviving crew members once colonial authorities began rounding up pirates for questioning, men with no particular reason to protect a captain who'd just abandoned them on a sandbar for cash. That's the version of history that tends to survive. Not the hero's account, but the grudge of the man he left behind. And it's worth pausing on, because it undercuts almost everything the legend wants you to believe about brotherhood among pirates, articles or no articles. The vote for captain and the compensation scale for lost limbs were real, and they did offer sailors more protection and voice than almost any other maritime job available to them in 1718. But Topsail Inlet is the moment the record shows that system bending under its own captain's convenience, and it should sit uneasily with you, the same way it clearly sat uneasily with the men left on that sandbar, watching their own captain's sails shrink toward the horizon. The Queen Anne's Revenge herself sank where she lay and stayed there, forgotten, buried in sand and silt a few hundred yards off the North Carolina coast, for 278 years. No monument marked her. No chart recorded her precisely enough for anyone to find her on purpose. She simply vanished from human attention the way most wrecks do. Not dramatically, just quietly, sediment settling over cannon and ballast stone year after year, while the story of the man who'd sailed her hardened into legend without her. We'll come back to her much later in tonight's story, because in 1996 a research team went looking for exactly this wreck, and what they found off Beaufort Inlet would end up rewriting almost everything historians thought they knew about Blackbeard's final months. For now, understand this. The ship that made Blackbeard famous was already gone, deliberately or not, months before a single Royal Navy sailor ever loaded a pistol in his name. He'd shrunk his own operation, cut his own crew, and sailed north into North Carolina waters, commanding a fraction of the force that had once held Charleston hostage. This is the story of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship that built Blackbeard's legend and then, in the same breath, quietly began the process of unmaking him, because the Navy didn't need to defeat an empire. By the time Lieutenant Maynard set out, there was hardly an empire left to defeat, just a smaller, quieter operation, propped up by something far less glamorous than cannon fire, a pardon, a governor's blind eye, and a very useful set of local friends. It helps to picture what La Concorde actually looked like in the moment of her capture, because the transformation that followed is easier to appreciate once you understand what she wasn't yet. She was a working merchant vessel of roughly 200 tons, built for cargo capacity rather than speed or combat, carrying a modest armament suited to deterring the occasional privateer rather than fighting a pitched naval battle. Her crew, weakened by 6 weeks at sea and by an outbreak of illness that had already killed a number of her own sailors during the crossing, numbered barely enough to sail her, let alone defend her. When Blackbeard's 3 vessels closed in, according to Captain Dossett's later deposition, there was some brief discussion among La Concorde's officers about whether resistance was even possible, and the conclusion, reached quickly, was that it wasn't. Dossett struck his colours before a single shot had to be fired in earnest, a decision that likely saved the lives of everyone still aboard, captor and captive alike, whatever else it cost him in pride or in his employer's later opinion of his conduct. The refit that followed, once Blackbeard brought his prize into a sheltered anchorage, took the better part of several weeks, according to accounts pieced together from multiple contemporary sources tracking his movements through the Caribbean that winter. Shipwrights and carpenters among his own crew, pirate ships routinely carried skilled tradesmen for exactly this purpose, since a fleet that couldn't repair or modify its own vessels wouldn't survive its first serious storm, cut additional gun ports into La Concorde's hull, reinforced her deck to bear the weight of the added cannon, and stripped out whatever cargo fittings remained from her previous life as a slaving vessel. Iron ballast was added low in the hold, to help stabilize her under the new weight riding higher up. None of this was glamorous work. It was carpentry, mostly, done by men more accustomed to violence than joinery. And it's worth remembering that behind every dramatic pirate flagship in the historical record sits weeks of unglamorous manual labor nobody bothered to write ballads about. Here's the detail that tends to get lost in translation between historical record and modern retelling. Queen Anne's Revenge, for all her fearsome reputation, was never actually a purpose-built warship. She was a converted merchant vessel, pressed into a role her original French builders never intended, and that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A genuine naval frigate of the period would have been built from the keel up with reinforced timbers specifically designed to absorb the recoil and structural stress of a full broadside, repeated volley after volley, without her own hull working itself loose at the seams. Queen Anne's Revenge carried 40 guns bolted into a hull that had been engineered for hauling cargo, not for sustained combat, which meant that every time she actually fired a full broadside in anger, she was placing a genuine strain on structural elements never designed to bear it. Historians studying the eventual wreck site have pointed to exactly this kind of cumulative stress as one plausible contributing factor in her final loss at Topsail Inlet, layered on top of whatever combination of accident and deliberate choice actually put her on that sandbar. A ship built to survive being scuttled by her own captain, in other words, might never have needed deliberate sabotage in the first place. Years of borrowed, ill-fitting service may have already been doing some of the work. It's worth asking, too, what actually happened to the roughly 100 enslaved Africans Blackbeard chose to keep aboard rather than put ashore with the rest of La Concorde's captives, because their story doesn't simply end at the moment of the ship's capture. Historical records here are frustratingly thin, the same way records concerning enslaved people so often are from this period. But scattered references suggest at least some were absorbed into the pirate crew's regular working roster, sharing watches and combat duty, alongside men who, months earlier, had been prepared to sell them at a Caribbean auction block. Whether that arrangement constituted anything resembling genuine freedom or simply a different, marginally less brutal form of coercion, is a question the surviving evidence can't fully answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise by reaching for a tidier conclusion than the record actually supports. What can be said with more confidence is that pirate crews of this era, Blackbeards included, were considerably more racially mixed than popular imagination typically assumes, out of practical necessity as much as any principle. A ship short on hands took skilled labor wherever it could find it, whatever color the hands attached to it happened to be. There's one more piece of the Charleston blockade worth adding before this chapter's story moves on, because it illustrates just how far Blackbeard's reputation had already outpaced his actual firepower by the spring of 1718. Charleston's harbor, at the time, was defended by a modest but real network of coastal fortifications, and the colony could, in theory, have mustered some organized resistance against a blockading pirate flotilla. It didn't, not seriously, and the reason had less to do with Blackbeard's 40 guns than with simple economics. Risking a pitched battle against a heavily armed pirate fleet, with an uncertain outcome, for the sake of a handful of hostages and some delayed shipping, made considerably less financial sense to Charleston's merchant class than simply paying the ransom and getting back to business. Blackbeard understood this calculation as well as anyone, arguably better, and it's a piece of the puzzle worth remembering the next time the story tempts you to picture him purely as a fighter rather than, just as often, a shrewd operator exploiting the economic incentives of the men he was extorting. That quieter operation and the strange, uneasy peace Blackbeard settled into after Topsail Inlet is where we go next. Life after the wreck was quieter than the legend admits, and quiet, it turns out, suited almost nobody aboard the sloop Adventure nearly as well as they'd hoped. You wake to the smell of tar and pine resin, which means somebody's been patching seams again, which means the Adventure is still taking on water somewhere she shouldn't be. It's early September of 1718, a few months after the wreck at Topsail Inlet, and you are one of perhaps 20 men left aboard a single sloop that used to be part of a 300-man flotilla. The ship smells like a working vessel because it is one. Tar, brine, unwashed wool, and under all of it, the faint sweetness of rum that never quite airs out of a deck once it's been spilled there enough times. You roll off a coil of rope that's been serving as your mattress and go looking for breakfast, which today, as most days, means salt pork boiled soft enough to chew and a hard biscuit you'll need to check for weevils before you commit to it. This is not the life of plunder the ballads promise. This is the pirate equivalent of a company downsizing after a merger falls through, and you are, unfortunately, one of the employees who got to keep his job. Here's the strange part, and it's the part almost nobody expects. You signed onto this crew for the money, and technically, you're not currently breaking any law at all. In June, not long after the wreck, Blackbeard sailed the Adventure into Bath, North Carolina, a tiny colonial settlement, barely more than a courthouse and a scattering of houses, and surrendered himself and his crew under the King's Act of Grace, a royal pardon offered to any pirate who turned himself in and swore off piracy going forward. It was a genuinely popular program up and down the American coast throughout 1718, and Blackbeard was far from the only well-known captain to take advantage of it. Colonial governors from the Bahamas to Virginia were actively encouraging pirates to surrender under its terms, since a blanket pardon was considerably cheaper than 100 naval patrols and considerably less likely to get a governor's own men killed. So you took it. You knelt or stood, or however it was administered in a room that probably smelled like candle wax and colonial ambition, and you walked out the other side legally, on paper, a free man with no criminal record. Blackbeard himself reportedly married a local teenage girl in Bath around this time. Sources differ wildly on whether she was his 14th wife or simply his most recent, since most of the earlier marriages exist only in legend, and you should treat any specific number with real skepticism. What's better documented is that the governor of North Carolina, a man named Charles Eden, personally presided over at least some of these pardons, which meant the highest-ranking official in the colony now had a working relationship with the most famous pirate on the Atlantic seaboard. You'll want to remember that name. It matters more than the wedding. The man beside you at breakfast most mornings goes by Henry Turnage, a former Bristol dockhand who signed the Adventure's articles back before the wreck and never made it into the captain's inner circle, which, at this point in the story, might be the safest place a man on this crew can be. Henry keeps a battered, salt-warped copy of the ship's articles folded inside his shirt, tucked against his ribs, where the papers stayed dry enough to survive 2 Atlantic crossings. Not because he needs to read it, he's got the whole thing memorized, share sizes and all, but because touching the paper seems to calm him on rough nights, the way some men worry a coin between their fingers. He's missing the top joint of 2 fingers on his left hand, lost to frostbite on an earlier voyage rather than to any battle, and he holds a marlin spike a little awkwardly because of it, a habit you notice within your first week aboard and never mention. Henry tells you, more than once, that he's saving his shares for a tavern back home, something small, something with his name over the door, instead of some captain's. It's a modest dream for a pirate, and that's exactly why you believe he might actually pull it off. Under the ship's articles, the closest thing this crew has to a constitution, Henry is entitled to a full share of any prize taken, the same as you, regardless of how long he's sailed or how well the captain happens to like him, and if he loses an eye or a limb in a fight, the articles guarantee him compensation on a fixed published scale, something no dockworker back in Bristol could ever have counted on from an employer. It's a strange kind of dignity built on violence and theft, but it's real, and it's more say over his own fate than Henry Turnage ever had loading crates on an English dock for somebody else's profit. The trouble is, a pardon doesn't pay wages, and neither does Bath, North Carolina, a town too small and too poor to keep 24 restless ex-pirates entertained for long. Within weeks, the exact timeline is murky, since nobody involved was keeping careful records of their own relapse into crime. Men on the Adventure started drifting back toward the only trade most of them actually knew. You watch it happen gradually. First it's small talk, about a merchant sloop spotted anchored a little too invitingly near the inlet. Then it's a trading voyage that returns with cargo nobody quite explains. Then, by autumn, it's simply understood, without anyone formally announcing it, that the pardon was a pause, not an ending. This is the pirate version of a company restructuring rather than closing. The paperwork says something respectable, and everyone quietly keeps doing the same job under a different letterhead. Days settle into a rhythm you didn't expect from a life of supposed adventure. Watches rotate every 4 hours. Meals are the same handful of preserved foods stretched thin. Salt pork, dried peas, biscuit, and, on good weeks, whatever fish somebody's managed to catch off the stern. Cards and dice fill the hours between watches, and disputes over gambling debts get settled the same way disputes over shares do, loudly, publicly, and with the quartermaster stepping in the moment, a disagreement threatens to turn into a knife fight, because a crew this small can't afford to lose a single working hand to a card game gone wrong. There's a superstition that runs through the mess deck about renaming a captured vessel before its first full voyage under new colours. Bad luck, several of the older hands insist. The kind of thing that gets a ship swallowed by the first serious squall it meets. You've never seen anyone actually test it, since nobody's eager to be the man who talked the crew into ignoring a superstition right before something goes wrong. By the time the leaves would have been turning back in Virginia, you wouldn't know, exactly, since nobody on a pirate sloop is tracking the seasons back home. The adventure had taken at least one more prize, a French vessel encountered somewhere off the Carolina coast, its cargo sold off through channels that, on paper, looked entirely legal. This is where Governor Eden's name comes back into the picture, and where the story stops being about pardons and starts being about something closer to a protection racket. Prizes taken by a pardoned man aren't supposed to exist. If you've sworn off piracy, there's no legal way to have captured a French ship in the first place. And yet the cargo got sold, through a colonial court process, with paperwork signed off by Eden's own customs collector, a man named Tobias Knight, declaring the French vessel abandoned at sea and salvaged rather than seized. You don't ask too many questions about how that particular fiction got approved. Neither does anyone else on the crew. Henry Turnage's own reckoning with all of this comes in October, during a supply run that puts the adventure briefly back in Bath's tiny harbour. The crew's quartermaster, the officer responsible, under the articles for dividing plunder fairly and settling disputes between captain and crew, calls a vote on distributing shares from the French prize, and Henry, when his turn comes to speak, asks to take his portion and leave the articles altogether, citing the 2 fingers he's already lost and a growing conviction that his luck, whatever was left of it, wasn't going to stretch much further. It's not desertion, not under a system built around consent rather than conscription, and the vote to release him passes without much argument. A hand with an honestly reduced grip and a mind clearly elsewhere isn't worth much in a fight, and everyone aboard understands that better than Henry has to explain it. He walks off the adventure with a modest but real sum in his pocket, enough, by his own accounting, to put down on a small tavern lease, somewhere along Bath's single muddy street, the pirate equivalent of cashing out before the market turns, and, as this story will eventually make clear, one of the better timed decisions made by anyone connected to this crew all year. You don't see Henry again after that. Somewhere in the back of your mind, over the weeks that follow, you'll find yourself hoping the tavern actually opened, hoping his memorized copy of the ship's articles finally got to retire alongside him, rather than going down with the rest of you. What happens below decks during the long-anchored weeks still ahead, the drinking, the disputes over shares, the slow fraying of a crew that used to number in the hundreds and now barely fills a single sloop, is its own story, and not one we're finished with. But that's not the thread we're pulling yet. By early November, the adventure has settled into something like a routine anchorage near Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow, difficult stretch of water separating the Pamlico Sound from the open Atlantic, chosen precisely because its sandbars make it nearly impossible for larger ships to follow you in. For now, understand this. You are anchored, pardoned on paper, quietly criminal in practice, protected by a governor who's taking his own cut, and utterly convinced that no one in Virginia has the reach, the ships, or the nerve to come after you in waters that technically aren't even Virginia's to police. You are, in other words, about to be catastrophically wrong, and the man about to prove it isn't even wearing a naval uniform on the day he first starts planning it. Blackbeard wasn't the only well-known captain to walk into a colonial courthouse that year and walk back out with a clean legal record. Stede Bonnet, a former army major turned pirate captain who'd sailed alongside Blackbeard for a stretch earlier in 1718, took a nearly identical pardon around the same period, in his case from the governor of North Carolina as well, before eventually relapsing into piracy under a barely disguised alias and meeting a considerably worse end than Blackbeard's crew would for several more months. The pattern repeats often enough across the Atlantic coast in 1718 that it's worth naming plainly. The Act of Grace wasn't a trap laid for careless pirates, and it wasn't, in most cases, cynically abused from the very first handshake. It was a genuinely generous offer, taken in good faith by men exhausted by a violent trade with a short life expectancy that simply couldn't compete, in the long run, against a life with no other prospects waiting on shore. Poverty, not villainy, dragged most of these men back to sea. That's a less satisfying story than pure greed, but it's the one the record actually supports. Daily life aboard a shrunken pirate crew, even a quietly relapsing one, still had to run on discipline, and discipline meant work nobody's ballad ever bothered to mention. Rigging needed constant tending, hemp rope stretched and frayed in salt air faster than most landsmen would ever guess, and a watch caught napping during a routine sail check could cost the whole crew a mast in the next hard blow. You spend a good portion of most mornings on exactly this kind of maintenance. Recoiling line, checking blocks for wear, patching sailcloth with a needle thick enough to double as a small weapon in a pinch. The ship's carpenter, a quiet man who rarely speaks above what's necessary to give an order, inspects the hull's patched seams from the earlier wreck almost daily, since a rushed repair job done in the panic of running aground has a way of working itself loose weeks later when you least expect it. It's tedious, unglamorous labour, the kind that makes up the overwhelming majority of a pirate's actual working life, wedged between the rare, violent hours that made it into the history books. Relations between the crew and Bath's small population of permanent residents settle, over these weeks, into something more complicated than either fear or friendship, closer, if anything, to the wary tolerance a small town extends to a factory that's simultaneously the only major employer in the county and the reason half its residents keep their doors locked at night. Some townspeople genuinely profit from the arrangement. A tavern keeper whose trade triples whenever the adventure is in port. A blacksmith paid handsomely and promptly for work most customers would haggle over for a week. Others keep their distance entirely, sending their children indoors whenever pirate crew members walk the town's single muddy street, aware, in the vague way small communities are always aware of uncomfortable truths, that Bath's unusual prosperity that autumn is being purchased with money that has someone else's blood on it somewhere further up the coast. Word reaches the Adventure, sometime in October, that a merchant sloop out of Virginia was recently stopped and relieved of a portion of her cargo somewhere along the Carolina coast. Not officially attributed to your crew in any documentation that survives, but close enough in timing and location that suspicion settles on you regardless. The 18th century equivalent of a neighborhood noticing a string of break-ins right after the new family moves in. You hear about it second-hand, the way most news reaches a ship at anchor, relayed by a supply trader who'd heard it from a fisherman who'd heard it from someone at the Bath courthouse. Congratulations, in a strange way, whatever plausible deniability the crew still enjoyed on paper is thinning fast, and everyone aboard can feel it, even if nobody says so directly over the evening meal. Here's the bad news nobody wants to be the first to say out loud. A pardon only protects you as long as nobody can prove, cleanly and publicly, that you've broken it. And clean, public proof has a way of accumulating quietly for months before it finally arrives all at once. The quartermaster aboard the Adventure, a position distinct from the captain's under most pirate articles, and in many ways more powerful in matters of everyday discipline, deserves a moment of attention here, because his role illustrates just how deliberately these crews balanced authority against captain's rule. Under the articles you signed, the captain commanded absolutely during battle or while chasing a prize, but the quartermaster held responsibility for dividing plunder fairly, settling disputes between crewmates, and administering punishment for violations of the articles themselves. A built-in check, in other words, against exactly the kind of captain's overreach that had marooned 24 men back at Topsail Inlet. It's an elegant piece of institutional design for a criminal enterprise, and it tells you something true about why men kept signing onto ships like this one, even after word of Blackbeard's Topsail Inlet maneuver had clearly spread. The system, however imperfectly it was sometimes honoured by the men at the very top, was still built around genuine consent and genuine recourse, in a way most 18th century employment simply wasn't. 300 miles north, in a governor's study in Williamsburg, a very different kind of scheme was already taking shape. One that would prove Ocracoke's sandbars weren't nearly as safe as everyone anchored behind them believed. Alexander Spotswood did not have the authority to do what he was about to do, and that inconvenient fact bothered him considerably less than it should have. By the autumn of 1718, Spotswood, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, a career soldier turned colonial administrator, with a reputation for ambition that consistently outpaced his patience for bureaucracy, had a problem that wasn't technically his to solve. Blackbeard's crew was operating out of Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina, harassing shipping and, worse from Spotswood's perspective, threatening the trade routes Virginia's tobacco planters depended on to get their crop to market. North Carolina's own governor, Charles Eden, showed no interest in doing anything about a pirate crew that, as we've just seen, was quietly enriching his own customs office. Spotswood, watching from across a colonial border he had no legal jurisdiction to cross, decided the solution was simple. If North Carolina wouldn't police its own waters, Virginia would do it for them, laws and boundaries be damned. It helps to understand the kind of governor Spotswood already was by 1718, because none of what follows happens in isolation from his character. He'd spent much of the previous several years locked in bitter disputes with Virginia's own colonial assembly over land policy, currency, and what his critics considered an overly autocratic style of rule. A man who preferred acting decisively and asking forgiveness afterward to the slower, more consultative style of governance his political opponents favoured. By the time Blackbeard's operation at Ocracoke became a genuine irritant to Virginia trade, Spotswood had a well-established habit of treating jurisdictional inconvenience as an obstacle to root around, rather than a rule to respect. Here's the thing about that decision. It wasn't just aggressive, it was genuinely of questionable legality, even by the standards of 1718 colonial administration. Spotswood had no authority to send armed forces into another colony's territorial waters to arrest men who, technically, held a royal pardon and had committed no crime Virginia could prove had occurred within Virginia's own borders. He didn't have direct command over Royal Navy warships either. Those answered to the Admiralty in London, not to a colonial governor, however energetically he might petition them. What Spotswood did have was persuasion, a working relationship with 2 Navy captains stationed off the Virginia coast, and a Virginia assembly he could pressure into passing a reward act after the fact, to make the whole operation look retroactively official. This is, in short, the pirate hunting equivalent of a manager launching a project without approval and hoping the results justify the paperwork later. The 2 Royal Navy warships Spotswood needed were HMS Pearl and HMS Lime, commanded respectively by Captain George Gordon and Captain Ellis Brand, both anchored in Virginia's waters as part of the colony's standing anti-piracy patrol. Here's the immediate problem, and it's the one that would end up defining the entire shape of the coming operation. Pearl and Lime were proper naval warships, deep-drafted vessels built for open ocean, and Ocracoke Inlet's sandbars sat in water shallow enough to ground almost anything larger than a fishing boat. You could not sail a Royal Navy man-of-war into Ocracoke Inlet, any more than you could parallel park an 18-wheeler into a compact spot outside a corner store. Everything the popular imagination pictures, a warship's broadside thundering across the water, the Union Jack snapping over a line of cannon, was physically impossible in the waters where this fight was actually going to happen. Whatever defeated Blackbeard, it would not be a warship. It would have to be something small, shallow, and quiet enough to slip in where the big ships couldn't follow. So Spotswood, Gordon, and Brand arranged something closer to a raid than a naval engagement. 2 small sloops, hired or requisitioned locally in Virginia, would be stripped of their heavier armament to reduce their draft, crewed with volunteer sailors pulled off Pearl and Lime, and sent in under a single officer to do, essentially by boarding and close-quarters fighting, what the Navy's actual warships were physically incapable of doing at range. The sloops were named Ranger and Jane. Command went to a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, a career officer serving aboard the Pearl, chosen, by most accounts, less for seniority than for the simple fact that he was willing to lead an operation with murky legal footing, uncertain funding, and a genuine chance of getting killed in a colony that wasn't even his own jurisdiction to defend. Money, as it usually does, complicated everything. Spotswood needed to fund crew pay, provisions, and, crucially, a reward large enough to motivate ordinary sailors to risk their lives boarding a pirate sloop in close combat, rather than simply reporting Blackbeard's location and letting someone else handle it. The Virginia Assembly eventually passed an act promising rewards on a sliding scale. £100 for Blackbeard himself, dead or alive, with progressively smaller amounts set aside for his officers, and, at the bottom of the scale, for ordinary crew members captured or killed. £100 in 1718 represented, by most contemporary comparisons, well over a year's wages for an ordinary sailor. A genuinely life-changing sum for whichever man could prove he'd killed or captured the most wanted pirate on the Atlantic seaboard. But that act wasn't formally in place before the expedition sailed, which meant Spotswood was, functionally, asking Navy sailors to trust a governor's word and a not yet ratified promise over their own physical safety. He also, according to later accusations from his political enemies in Virginia, put up a portion of the funding from his own pocket, or through private arrangement rather than official colonial treasury funds, a detail that would later fuel accusations that Spotswood was less interested in justice than in personal profit, and the prestige of having personally orchestrated Blackbeard's downfall. That accusation, incidentally, isn't just retrospective cynicism from modern historians. It circulated at the time, loudly, among Spotswood's political rivals in the Virginia Assembly, men who'd already clashed with him over land policy, taxation, and his generally autocratic style of governance. Here's the layer almost nobody puts in the highlight reel. Spotswood stood to gain directly and personally from a successful expedition, both in reward money and in political capital, as the governor who cleared the coast of the most feared pirate in the Atlantic. Whether that self-interest made him more or less committed to actually finishing the job is a fair question, and not one the historical record answers cleanly. Motive and outcome, in Spotswood's case, happen to point in exactly the same direction, which makes it almost impossible to separate ambition from genuine public service. There's a jurisdictional wrinkle here worth sitting with, because it's the part of this story that sounds almost too absurd to be real, and yet is thoroughly documented in the correspondence that survives. Ocracoke Inlet sat inside North Carolina, not Virginia. Spotswood was, in effect, authorizing an armed incursion by naval and hired forces into a neighboring colony's sovereign waters, to arrest men who, remember, technically held a valid royal pardon and hadn't been formally charged with any post-pardon crime under North Carolina law, whatever Spotswood privately believed about their recent activity. North Carolina's governor, Charles Eden, had not requested this operation, had not been consulted about it, and, given his own quiet financial relationship with Blackbeard's crew, very likely would have blocked it entirely if he'd caught wind of the planning in time. Spotswood's solution to that inconvenient fact was straightforward and, again, not entirely legal. Move fast, say little, and let the outcome make the legal argument for him after the fact. Success, he was betting, would make the jurisdictional questions retroactively irrelevant. It's a strategy every ambitious executive since has quietly attempted at least once, usually with considerably lower stakes than a beheading. Maynard sailed from Kecoughtan, near modern Hampton, Virginia, on the 17th of November 1718, commanding roughly 57 men split across the two sloops, Ranger and Jane, neither vessel carrying much in the way of heavy cannon. The whole point of stripping them down had been to get through Ocracoke's shallows, which meant this fight, whenever it came, was going to be decided at close range, with pistols, cutlasses, and whatever nerve 57 underpaid, underarmed sailors could muster against a crew they'd been told was significantly more dangerous than it actually, by this point, was. Spotswood stayed behind in Williamsburg. He would not see Ocracoke, would not hear the broadside that nearly ended the operation before it began, would not stand on Jane's blood-slicked deck when the fighting finally turned to blades. Whatever happened at Ocracoke, he would receive the news second-hand, the same way you're receiving it now, which meant that for every man aboard those two sloops, the operation was about to become considerably more real and considerably more personal than it had ever been for the governor who'd set it in motion. Spotswood's word carried weight in this arrangement partly because of who he already was by 1718, a man who'd previously overseen the founding of Germanna, a settlement of German immigrant miners on Virginia's western frontier, and who'd spent years pushing an ambitious, occasionally reckless vision of colonial expansion against a Virginia assembly that frequently found his methods high-handed. He was, by most surviving accounts, a competent and genuinely energetic administrator, the kind of governor who treated an obstacle as a personal challenge rather than a signal to slow down. That same energy, applied to frontier settlement, had produced real, lasting infrastructure for the colony. Applied to an unauthorized cross-border pirate hunt, it produced something considerably more legally fraught, but the underlying temperament driving both projects was exactly the same. Spotswood's awareness of the Ocracoke problem didn't arrive as a single dramatic report. It built gradually over the second half of 1718, through a steady trickle of complaints from Virginia merchants whose ships had been harassed, delayed, or boarded by vessels believed to be operating out of Blackbeard's anchorage, along with correspondence from ship captains describing near misses in waters that used to be considered safe. By autumn, the volume of these complaints had grown loud enough and costly enough to Virginia's tobacco trade that Spotswood could no longer treat the situation as North Carolina's problem to solve in its own time. Every week, Blackbeard's crew remained active at Ocracoke represented, in very literal terms, money draining out of Virginia's own colonial economy, a motivation considerably less romantic than the cleansing the seas of evil framing later generations would prefer, but a far more historically accurate one. Persuading Captains Gordon and Brand to commit men and resources to an operation with such uncertain legal footing wasn't automatic either, whatever the swift final outcome might suggest. Both captains commanded Royal Navy vessels answerable, formally, to the Admiralty in London rather than to a colonial governor's requests, and lending crew and equipment to what amounted to a private cross-border raid carried genuine professional risk if the operation went badly or drew unwanted scrutiny from London afterward. Spotswood's persuasion, according to the surviving correspondence, leaned heavily on the practical argument that inaction carried its own risk, that a pirate haven left unchallenged at North Carolina's border would only grow bolder and more disruptive to shipping. The two captains were already charged with protecting. Whatever combination of duty, ambition, and simple frustration ultimately won them over, both captains agreed to release men and vessels for the operation, setting in motion the strange, hybrid expedition that would eventually sail south under Maynard's command. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it was, structurally, for a colonial governor to assemble a fighting force this way at all. Spotswood held no formal military command of his own beyond Virginia's modest local militia, which meant that everything about this operation, the sloops, the sailors, the naval officer in charge, had to be borrowed, negotiated, or improvised from resources that technically belonged to someone else's chain of command. In short, Spotswood wasn't commanding an operation so much as brokering one, piecing together just enough cooperation from just enough different parties to get 2 sloops and 57 men moving south before anyone with the actual authority to stop him thought to ask too many questions. It's an approach that worked, in the end, spectacularly well. It's also an approach that would have collapsed instantly under any serious scrutiny had the mission failed instead of succeeded, a fact Spotswood seems to have understood perfectly well and simply decided not to let slow him down. Choosing Maynard specifically, rather than a more senior officer, also reflected a quieter calculation worth naming plainly. If the operation went badly, or if its questionable legality eventually drew unwelcome attention from London, a lieutenant made a considerably more expendable public face for the whole affair than a full captain would have. This isn't to suggest Spotswood, Gordon, or Brand were cynically sacrificing Maynard's career or safety without regard for the man himself. Nothing in the surviving correspondence suggests Maynard was anything other than a willing, capable volunteer for the role. But it's worth noticing all the same that the officer who ended up risking his life in close combat against Blackbeard wasn't the governor who conceived the mission, and wasn't even the senior captains who supplied the ships and men. He was the man in the middle, entrusted with an enormous share of the actual danger and a comparatively modest share of the credit that would follow, a pattern that repeats itself in more than a few chapters of naval history, on both sides of any given conflict. While Maynard's sloops made their slow way south down the Virginia coast, the men chosen to crew them were living through a very different kind of preparation than any battle they'd fought before, one built less around cannon drill than around inventory, arithmetic, and the particular anxiety of volunteering for a fight nobody could promise you'd survive. You've served aboard HMS Pearl for the better part of 2 years, long enough to know the ship's rhythms in your sleep, and none of that experience prepares you for the strange, half-improvised week that begins when your name gets called for what the officers are quietly calling special service. The smell hits you first, before you've even fully understood what's happening. Bilge water and tar from below decks, mixed with the sharper, more urgent scent of gun oil as the armourer's mates work through the Pearl's stores faster than you've ever seen them move. It's mid-November of 1718, cold enough on deck that your breath shows, and word has come down from Captain Gordon that a detachment of volunteers is needed for a shore-adjacent operation under a Lieutenant Maynard. Pay uncertain, danger significant, glory, if it comes at all, entirely dependent on whether the whole scheme actually works. You volunteer. Most men in your position do, and not purely out of patriotism. There's a particular kind of restlessness that builds up after 2 years of routine patrol duty, one that makes even a badly funded, jurisdictionally questionable raid into a neighbouring colony sound like an adventure worth having. Standing next in the muster line is a young topman named Josiah Fane, barely 19, who signed on to Pearl only the year before and has never fired a shot at anyone in his life. He's got the kind of face that hasn't quite decided whether it's still a boy's, and a habit of tugging at his left earlobe when he's thinking, which you notice within the first hour because he does it roughly every third sentence. Josiah tells you, unprompted, that he's got an older brother apprenticed to a cooper back in Portsmouth, and that he's always privately thought barrel making looked like steadier work than sailing. Less drowning involved, he points out, with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man who's clearly turned that particular joke over in his head more than once. A promised share of £100 bounty, split among a crew of 50-odd men, still beats a sailor's ordinary wage by a wide margin. An able seaman in the Royal Navy in 1718 might expect somewhere around 23 shillings a month, meaning even a modest slice of that reward represented years of ordinary pay compressed into a single payout, assuming, of course, you live to collect it. Here's the mundane truth behind the daring raid you'll eventually hear sung about in taverns. Most of your week isn't spent sharpening cutlasses or rehearsing boarding maneuvers. It's spent hauling. The two sloops requisitioned for the mission, Ranger and Jane, small, shallow-drafted vessels entirely unlike the deep-hulled Pearl you're used to, need to be stripped of their heavier guns before they can safely cross Ocracoke's sandbars. And stripping a ship of cannon is back-breaking, unglamorous work, involving block and tackle, aching forearms, and a great deal of very careful cursing as several hundred pounds of iron get swung, inch by inch, off a rocking deck and onto a waiting boat. You do this alongside Josiah, who talks while he works, mostly about what he plans to do with his share of the reward. New tools, he says, so he can finally apprentice properly as a cooper once his naval service ends. You let him talk. It's better than thinking too hard about what the guns are being removed to make room for. By your third day of preparation, the arithmetic of the whole operation starts to sink in properly, and it's not comforting. 57 men, split across two sloops, most of them now armed with pistols, cutlasses, and whatever boarding axes the quartermaster could spare, are being sent after a pirate crew whose numbers nobody in Virginia actually knows for certain. Reports range from a dozen men to nearly 30, and considering how badly information travels between colonies that don't particularly trust each other, you'd be forgiven for assuming the real number sits somewhere in between, and nobody's especially eager to bet their life on which end. What you do know, because Lieutenant Maynard says it plainly during muster on the fourth day, standing on Ranger's deck with his hands clasped behind his back like a schoolmaster delivering unwelcome news, is that the sloop's shallow draft means Ocracoke's sandbars that keep the Navy's proper warships out will keep you in. There's no fast retreat option once you're committed to the inlet's narrow channels. Maynard doesn't dress this up. He tells you plainly that Ocracoke is a trap for both sides equally, and that whoever wins the fight will win it there, in close, with whatever they're carrying in their hands, not from a safe distance with cannon. Local pilots are brought aboard around this time, men who actually know Ocracoke's channels, since neither Maynard nor most of his volunteer crew have ever navigated the inlet themselves, and running your own sloop aground before the fight even starts would be a spectacularly undignified way to end the operation. One of these pilots, according to accounts from the expedition, had previously worked trading vessels through the Pamlico Sound and knew the sandbars the way you know the layout of a room you've lived in your whole life, a skill considerably more valuable in this particular fight than any amount of cutlass training, though nobody's handing out reward money for excellent seamanship alone. You notice, watching him mark up a rough chart by lamplight, just how much of this entire operation depends on knowledge nobody in a naval uniform actually possesses: local knowledge, terrain, the specific behavior of tides in a specific inlet 300 miles from where any of you grew up. The Navy's advantage, in other words, isn't really naval at all. It's borrowed. During a brief provisioning stop along the way south, a local trader passing salt fish up to the deck mentions, almost offhandedly, that Ocracoke's been teacher's water for the better part of a year now, and that half of Bath does business with his crew, whether they'll admit it in daylight or not. It's the kind of second-hand detail that never makes it into an official report. Nobody's writing down a fish merchant's gossip in a Navy log, but it travels through the crew by evening all the same, and it does more to sharpen everyone's nerves than Maynard's official briefing ever managed. If a fish trader 3 colonies away already knows how deeply Blackbeard's roots run into North Carolina's own government, you find yourself wondering just how much of a surprise this operation is actually going to be. There's a quieter undercurrent running through the preparation too, one that doesn't make it into the official correspondence, but shows up in the small talk between men hauling rope and checking pistol flints. Nobody's entirely sure this operation is legal, and everybody's pretending not to notice. Josiah asks you outright one evening whether it's proper for Virginia men to go arresting, or worse, killing, pirates who hold a royal pardon, in a colony that isn't Virginia's to police in the first place. You don't have a good answer, and neither, honestly, does anyone else aboard, including the officers. What you have instead is Lieutenant Governor Spotswood's promise of reward money, a captain's orders, and the particular kind of moral clarity that comes easily when the men you're hunting are, whatever their legal status on paper, still widely believed to be robbing and terrorizing merchant shipping up and down the coast. It's easier to sail toward a fight when you've decided the paperwork isn't really the point. By the time Ranger and Jane actually get underway on the 17th of November, the guns are stowed, the pilots are aboard, and the crew has settled into the particular quiet that comes over sailors in the last stretch before a fight. Nobody can be sure they'll survive. Josiah finds you the night before departure, sitting near the rail with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper, and asks, a little sheepishly, whether you'd be willing to carry a letter back to his brother in Portsmouth if things go badly. Nothing dramatic in it, he insists, just in case. You agree, fold the letter into your coat, and don't mention it again, because there's nothing useful left to say once a 19-year-old has already written his own contingency plan. You spend the voyage south checking your pistol twice a day, not because it needs checking, but because your hands need something to do. Congratulations, in a sense. You volunteered your way into one of the strangest naval operations of the entire Golden Age of Piracy. One where the actual warships never fire a shot, where victory depends entirely on 2 hollowed-out sloops and 57 men willing to close the distance by hand. What you don't know yet, and what nobody aboard Ranger or Jane could have guessed, is that the man you're sailing toward has spent the last several weeks building exactly the kind of local protection that should have made this whole plan impossible. A protection built not on cannon or crew numbers, but on a colonial governor's willful blindness and a customs officer's very personal financial stake in Blackbeard staying free. The 2 sloops themselves, Ranger and Jane, weren't Navy vessels at all in any permanent sense, and understanding where they actually came from tells you something about how threadbare this entire operation really was underneath its official framing. Both were ordinary working sloops, the kind used up and down the Virginia and Carolina coast for local trade and fishing, hired or requisitioned for the specific purpose of this expedition, and never intended to serve any longer than the mission required. Neither carried a name that meant anything to naval history before November of 1718, and neither would carry much weight in it afterward beyond this single voyage. You find that fact oddly grounding once you sit with it. The vessel you're about to risk your life aboard was, a few weeks earlier, probably hauling barrels of salt fish or tobacco between minor Virginia ports, with no more glamorous a career ahead of her than any other coastal workhorse. There's something almost fitting about that, given how unglamorous the whole operation turns out to actually be underneath its later legend. Provisioning for the voyage south takes up a full day on its own, and it's exactly as dull as it sounds. Salt pork, dried peas, ship's biscuit and small beer get loaded aboard in quantities calculated against an estimated week or more at sea, since nobody involved in the planning can say with any confidence how long the operation might actually take once Ranger and Jane reach Ocracoke. You spend part of the afternoon helping stow casks below deck, working alongside Josiah, who complains good-naturedly about the smell of the salt pork barrels even as he keeps eating the stuff without complaint at every meal. The particular hypocrisy of a hungry sailor, tolerated by everyone because everyone shares it. Fresh water gets the most careful attention of all, since a cracked or contaminated water cask days into a voyage, this uncertain could turn a fighting expedition into a survival crisis before a single shot's even fired. The night before departure, you notice more men than usual gathered near the rail after the evening meal, talking in low voices about ordinary things. Home, families, debts owed and owed to them, the way men do when nobody wants to say out loud what's actually on their mind. Josiah's among them, though quieter than his usual self, tugging at his earlobe more than talking. Maynard himself makes a final round of the deck that evening, checking in briefly with each knot of men, rather than delivering any grand speech, which strikes you, in hindsight, as exactly the right instinct for a commander leading volunteers into a fight this uncertain. Not inspiration, just steadiness, the reassurance of an officer who seems to have already made his peace with whatever tomorrow brings, and expects you to find your own way to the same place before morning. One detail from the preparations rarely makes it into the retelling, and it's worth including precisely because of how ordinary it is. Several of the volunteer sailors, Josiah among them, spent part of that final week writing out simple wills, dictated to whichever crewmate had the steadiest hand and the most legible penmanship, since not every man aboard could write his own. It wasn't treated as a morbid exercise so much as a practical one, the same unglamorous administrative task any sensible person facing real risk might attend to, and the ship's purser collected the folded pages without much ceremony, tucking them away alongside the muster rolls and provision inventories. You dictate a short one yourself, more out of following the crowd than any particular conviction that you'll need it, and you're mildly surprised afterward by how much lighter the whole business of tomorrow feels once it's done, as though naming the possibility out loud had somehow made it easier to set aside rather than harder to face. That protection, and the men who built it, deserve their own telling, because without understanding exactly how deep the corruption at Bath ran, it's impossible to understand just how confident Blackbeard had every reason to feel, right up until the moment it stopped mattering. If Ocracoke was a trap built from sandbars and shallow water, Bath, North Carolina was a trap built from something considerably more human, a governor who needed money, a customs official who needed a share, and a pirate willing to supply both. Tobias Knight held the title of Chief Justice and Collector of Customs for North Carolina, a position that made him, on paper, one of the colony's chief enforcers of maritime law, the man legally responsible for inspecting cargo, verifying ownership, and stopping exactly the kind of piracy Blackbeard's crew had resumed within weeks of accepting the king's pardon. In practice, by the autumn of 1718, Knight had become something closer to Blackbeard's business partner, and the evidence for that arrangement isn't speculation dressed up as history. It's documented, physical, and about as damning as colonial-era evidence ever gets. Here's the system as it actually functioned, and it's worth walking through slowly because it explains something the swashbuckling version of this story tends to skip entirely. Piracy, by 1718, wasn't purely a matter of cutlasses and boarding parties. It was, just as often, a paperwork problem, and paperwork problems have solutions if you know the right official to bribe. When a pirate crew captured a vessel, the goods aboard her needed to be sold somewhere, through some channel that wouldn't immediately mark the buyer as a receiver of stolen property. A customs collector's office existed, in principle, precisely to prevent that kind of laundering, to require documentation proving a cargo's legitimate origin before it could be sold in a colonial market. Knight's office instead provided the opposite, a channel that manufactured exactly the documentation needed to make stolen cargo look legal. The clearest documented example is the French vessel Blackbeard's crew captured in late summer of 1718, the very ship we saw sold off back at the Ocracoke anchorage. Cargo seized by pirates could be declared, through Knight's customs authority, as legally salvaged property from an abandoned vessel found adrift at sea, a fiction that required nobody to actually check whether the ship in question had truly been abandoned, or had instead been relieved of its cargo at gunpoint a few days earlier. Knight signed off on these declarations. In exchange, by later testimony and by physical evidence found in his own home, he received a cut. That physical evidence matters, because it's the difference between a corruption story built on rumour and one built on something a court could actually weigh. After Blackbeard's death, investigators searching Knight's property discovered goods that could be directly traced to pirated cargo. Among them, according to the record, barrels of sugar bearing marks consistent with vessels known to have been taken by Blackbeard's crew. This wasn't circumstantial gossip whispered in a Bath tavern. It was contraband sitting in a colonial official's own storehouse, the 18th century equivalent of finding the stolen goods, still wearing their original price tags. Knight's defense, when the accusations eventually caught up with him, amounted to claiming the goods had been legitimately purchased, a defense that grew considerably harder to sustain once witnesses began describing personal visits between Knight and Blackbeard, and once Israel Hands, whom we'll return to properly later, offered testimony directly implicating him. Bath itself was a small enough place that this kind of relationship couldn't have stayed entirely private even if everyone involved had wanted it to. The town, founded barely a decade earlier, held only a handful of houses, a courthouse, and a scattering of warehouses along the Pamlico River, small enough that a sloop the size of the Adventure anchoring nearby was, by definition, town news, not a quiet arrival. Blackbeard's marriage there, whatever the exact circumstances, would have been witnessed by most of the settlement's residents, and his crew's presence in the town's single tavern and general store would have been impossible to overlook. According to testimony given after his death, Blackbeard and Knight reportedly dined together on at least one occasion at Knight's own home during this period, a detail that, while filtered again through second-hand accounts rather than a signed dinner invitation, fits comfortably with everything else the physical evidence suggests about how openly the two men's business was conducted. At least one Bath resident later gave an account, relayed through colonial correspondence rather than preserved as sworn testimony in its own right, describing goods being carried under cover of darkness from the Adventure directly to Knight's property along the riverbank, barrels moved by lantern light, quietly enough to avoid the town's attention, but not quietly enough to avoid it entirely. Small towns rarely keep secrets as well as the people involved assume they will, and Bath, it seems, was no exception. Governor Charles Eden's role sits one careful step further removed, and historians have argued for 3 centuries about exactly how much he knew versus how much he simply chose not to ask. What's beyond dispute is that Eden personally presided over Blackbeard's pardon in June of 1718, that he permitted, whether through negligence or complicity, a pardoned pirate crew to continue operating openly out of a colonial port under his direct authority, and that at least one prize taken by that crew was processed through official channels his own government controlled. It's worth weighing the case both ways rather than settling too quickly on the more dramatic version. In Eden's favour, a colonial governor in 1718 relied heavily on subordinates like Knight to manage the day-to-day machinery of customs and trade, and it's entirely possible Eden simply failed to scrutinise paperwork that Knight had every incentive to make look ordinary. Against him, Eden presided personally over the pardon ceremony, meaning he had direct, face-to-face knowledge of exactly who Blackbeard was and exactly how recently he'd been terrorising the coast, which makes willful blindness afterward a considerably harder case to make sympathetically. The honest answer, again, is that the surviving record doesn't resolve this cleanly, and treating it as settled in either direction would be doing the evidence more credit than it deserves. Here's the thing worth sitting with, because it reframes almost everything about why Blackbeard felt so confident anchoring openly at Ocracoke through the autumn of 1718. He wasn't hiding. He didn't need to. He had a working, if entirely corrupt, relationship with the highest levels of North Carolina's colonial government, a customs official actively laundering his prizes, and a governor either complicit or conveniently incurious enough not to interfere. From where Blackbeard sat, the system wasn't something to evade. It was something he'd successfully purchased. It's worth noting, too, that Blackbeard wasn't operating in a vacuum here. Colonial authorities up and down the American coast were fighting a genuinely uneven patchwork war against piracy throughout 1718, with wildly different results depending on which governor you happened to be dealing with. Around this same period, in the Bahamas, a newly appointed governor named Woodys Rogers was pursuing a far more aggressive and, by most accounts, considerably more honest campaign against pirates operating out of Nassau, offering pardons on genuinely enforced terms and backing them with real naval pressure rather than quiet financial arrangements. The contrast matters. Blackbeard's survival at Ocracoke wasn't simply a matter of piracy being hard to stop everywhere. It was a matter of North Carolina, specifically, being an unusually corrupt and permissive place to be a pirate, at exactly the moment other colonies were finally getting serious. This is where the story's central irony sharpens into focus, and it's worth stating plainly, Blackbeard's real defense against the Royal Navy was never his cannon, his crew, or even his fearsome reputation. It was corruption, a quiet, unglamorous, thoroughly documented system of bribery and false paperwork that made him, for a period of several months, functionally untouchable within North Carolina's own borders. Spotswood understood this as well as anyone, which is precisely why his expedition had to be run outside official channels, outside proper jurisdiction, and outside any process that would have required North Carolina's cooperation. Because the moment Eden or Knight caught wind of an approaching threat, they had every incentive, financial and personal, to warn Blackbeard long before Maynard's sloops ever reached Ocracoke's sandbars. Did that warning ever actually arrive? Here the record turns frustratingly thin, and it's important to say so honestly, rather than filling the gap with a satisfying but unsupported claim. Some later accounts suggest Blackbeard had at least some advance notice that a Virginia-sponsored expedition might be forming, given how openly Spotswood had been discussing the plan among Virginia's own political circles in the weeks prior. Colonial gossip travelled faster than official orders, more often than either government liked to admit. But there's no solid documentary evidence that Eden or Knight specifically tipped him off in time to prepare a meaningful defence, and what happened on the morning of the battle itself suggests a crew that was, at best, only partially braced for what was coming. Whatever confidence Blackbeard carried into that final anchorage came less from certainty that no one was hunting him, and more from certainty that no one in North Carolina's government would lift a finger to help if someone did. That confidence, built on bribery rather than genuine safety, is the last thing standing between Blackbeard and the two stripped-down sloops now working their way south through unfamiliar water. What happens when that confidence meets Robert Maynard's 57 volunteers on a cold morning at anchor in Ocracoke Inlet is where this story stops being about corrupt paperwork and starts being about gunpowder, close-quarters violence, and a ruse that very nearly didn't work. It's worth understanding, in slightly more technical terms, exactly what kind of legal machinery Knight was actually abusing, because the fraud only really lands once you see how thin the disguise had to be. Colonial vice-admiralty courts existed throughout the American colonies specifically to adjudicate maritime claims, questions of salvage, ownership and prize, and their processes generally required some form of documentation, establishing a vessel's legitimate origin before goods from it could be lawfully sold. A genuinely abandoned ship, found drifting with no crew aboard, could be claimed by whoever located her first, with a portion of her value owed to the Crown and the finder, entitled to the rest as a salvage reward. It's an entirely reasonable maritime law, built for an era when storms genuinely did separate crews from their vessels with some regularity. Knight's fraud consisted of nothing more sophisticated than certifying pirated vessels as fitting this exact legal category, converting theft into salvage with a signature and a fabricated story about an empty ship found drifting, paperwork thin enough that it would never have survived serious scrutiny had anyone with the authority to provide that scrutiny actually wanted to. North Carolina's vulnerability to exactly this kind of arrangement wasn't unique in the broader Atlantic world, and it helps to see Bath as one especially corrupt example of a much wider, uneven pattern. The Bahamas, before Woodes Rogers's arrival as governor in the summer of 1718, had spent years functioning as an almost lawless pirate haven in its own right, with Nassau serving as an open base of operations for dozens of captains who saw little reason to fear any colonial authority at all. Rogers's appointment and his considerably more aggressive enforcement of the same royal pardon program Blackbeard had accepted represented a genuine turning point in the broader campaign against Atlantic piracy, proof that a governor determined to actually enforce the law rather than quietly profit from ignoring it could meaningfully change the calculation for pirates weighing whether to stay in the trade. North Carolina, under Eden, simply hadn't reached that turning point yet, and Blackbeard, whatever else you make of his judgment, had correctly identified exactly which colonial government still offered the safest harbour available to him on the entire Atlantic coast. The investigation that eventually unravelled Knight's arrangement, once it finally began in earnest after Blackbeard's death, moved with a thoroughness that suggests just how much frustration had been quietly building against him even before the evidence became public. Investigators searching his property didn't stumble onto the contraband by accident. Multiple witnesses, emboldened once Blackbeard was no longer alive to protect his end of the bargain, came forward with specific claims about where goods had been stored, which barrels bore which marks, and which visits between Knight and the pirate crew had taken place on which dates. It's a pattern worth noticing on its own. The corruption that had felt untouchable while Blackbeard lived collapsed with startling speed once the one man capable of protecting it was gone, suggesting that far more of Bath's population had known, or at least strongly suspected, what was happening than anyone had been willing to say aloud while the adventure still sat anchored nearby. There's a final, quieter irony buried inside this whole arrangement, and it's worth naming before the story moves on to the fighting itself. The very system of pardons meant to end men like Blackbeard's criminal careers had, in North Carolina at least, become the exact mechanism that let those careers continue, almost uninterrupted. A pardon granted in good faith, followed by a governor and a customs collector willing to look away from the relapse that followed, produced a strange hybrid status, neither fully pirate nor fully reformed, that gave Blackbeard's crew nearly all the advantages of continued crime with almost none of its usual risks. It's the kind of loophole that looks obvious in hindsight and nearly invisible from inside the system itself, which is precisely how most institutional corruption tends to survive as long as it does. Not through some elaborate conspiracy, but through a series of individually plausible decisions that nobody with the power to stop them ever quite got around to questioning. It's tempting, looking back on Bath's arrangement with the clean hindsight of 3 centuries, to treat Knight and Eden as uniquely villainous men operating in a system otherwise defined by honest administration. That framing flatters the rest of colonial officialdom considerably more than the surviving record actually supports. Customs fraud, bribery, and quiet arrangements between colonial officials and smugglers of one kind or another were common enough across the American colonies throughout this period that historians studying the broader Atlantic economy treat outright honesty among customs collectors as the genuine exception rather than the rule. What made Bath's specific arrangement remarkable wasn't its basic shape, which was depressingly ordinary, but its scale and its proximity to the single most notorious pirate captain then operating anywhere on the coast, a combination dramatic enough to survive in the historical record when countless smaller, Quieter versions of the same arrangement, involving less famous smugglers and less famous officials, simply faded into the ordinary background noise of 18th century colonial trade. The sandbars that had sheltered Blackbeard all autumn were about to do the exact same job for the men hunting him, which meant, for the first time since Topsail Inlet, both sides were finally about to fight on equal, ungenerous terms. The evening of the 21st of November, 1718, settles cold and still over Ocracoke Inlet, and both crews spend it fully aware of each other. Maynard's two sloops anchor within sight of Blackbeard's Adventure, close enough that on a quiet night, voices carry faintly across the water. Laughter, at one point, drifting from the pirate sloop, which strikes you, standing watch aboard Jane, as either genuine confidence or a very convincing performance of it. According to later accounts, Blackbeard spent at least part of that final evening drinking with several of his men, rather than making any particular effort to prepare a defense, a detail that fits with everything you already suspect about how safe he still believed himself to be. You don't sleep much, nobody around you does either. Your knees are aching from 3 days spent half-crouched on Jane's deck, and that particular discomfort is the last thing you register clearly before everything else stops mattering entirely. It's the morning of the 22nd. Some records place the decisive action a day earlier, on the 21st, and the confusion isn't sloppiness on your part, but a genuine quirk of how differently ships' logs and colonial correspondence sometimes tracked dates that autumn. And Ocracoke Inlet is grey, cold and quiet, in the particular way water gets quiet right before something happens to it. Here's the part almost nobody expects, and the part that undercuts the entire heroic naval assault version of this story before the fighting even properly begins. Maynard's sloops run aground trying to close the distance, twice. Ocracoke sandbars, the same shallow water that had kept the Royal Navy's proper warships out of this fight entirely, nearly stop the backup plan too, and for a stretch of the early morning, your sloop sits stuck fast in the mud, while Blackbeard's Adventure, smaller, lighter, and crewed by men who know these waters considerably better than any of you do, maneuvers freely nearby. You spend those minutes throwing overboard anything you can spare, water casks, spare gear, whatever might lighten the hull enough to float free, working with the particular desperate efficiency of men who understand that being stuck and helpless in range of an armed pirate sloop is not a survivable position for long. Blackbeard, watching this happen, does something that later accounts describe with almost theatrical relish. Rather than simply waiting for the tide to free your sloops, he calls out across the water, according to testimony given afterward by surviving crew, something in the spirit of a toast or a taunt aimed at Maynard directly, dismissing him as unworthy of quarter and daring him to close the distance if he dared. The exact wording, as recorded decades later in the dramatized Johnson account, should be treated with real caution. It reads suspiciously like a line written for maximum theatrical effect, rather than transcribed verbatim from a chaotic morning at sea. But the underlying gesture, a captain openly mocking his pursuers from a position of apparent advantage, fits everything else we know about how Blackbeard used reputation and bravado as weapons in their own right. By your second attempt at closing the gap, both sloops finally work free of the sandbar, and the Adventure opens fire first. This is the moment the popular version of the story tends to compress into a single dramatic beat, and it deserves better than that, because what actually happened here decided almost the entire outcome of the battle before a single boarding pike was raised. Blackbeard's sloop carried a broadside loaded with what witnesses later described as a devastating mix of shot, nails, scrap iron, and grape shot, packed to maximize casualties across an open deck rather than punch through hull planking, the maritime equivalent of choosing to spray a crowd rather than aim at a single target. It worked with horrifying efficiency. On Ranger, the sloop carrying a good portion of your fellow volunteers, the single broadside killed the sloop's own commanding officer, a man named Mr. Hyde, along with several other men outright, and wounded roughly half the remaining crew in one devastating pass. Jane, your sloop, took casualties too, though somewhat lighter. In the space of perhaps 30 seconds, Blackbeard's smaller, more lightly armed vessel had inflicted more damage than most naval engagements manage in an entire afternoon. The deck around you, in the seconds after that broadside, is not a place you want to remember clearly, and most of the men who survived it never spoke about the details afterward, beyond what a court required them to. Wounded men are dragged toward whatever shelter the low rail can offer. Somebody is shouting for the ship's few buckets, more out of reflex than any real hope they'll matter. Ranger, off to your side, has gone quiet in the specific, terrible way a ship goes quiet when the people who'd normally be shouting orders are no longer able to. This is the point in the fight where Maynard makes the decision that actually wins it, and it has nothing to do with cannon, courage, or any of the theatrical elements the ballads prefer. Recognizing that Jane's remaining crew stood little chance in an open exchange of gunfire against a well-handled broadside, Maynard orders every man still standing below decks, out of sight, leaving the sloop's deck looking abandoned, its crew apparently wiped out by the earlier volley. You go below with the others, packed into a hold that smells like blood and bilge water in roughly equal measure, gripping a cutlass and a loaded pistol, waiting in near-total darkness for a signal you've been told will come, but can't be entirely certain you'll actually hear in time. It is, by any reasonable definition, a trap, the naval equivalent of playing dead, and it depends entirely on Blackbeard believing what his eyes are telling him, rather than questioning why an apparently gutted crew would leave their own sloop drifting so conveniently close. Blackbeard takes the bait. Seeing Jane's deck apparently cleared and believing the fight essentially won, he orders his own men to board her directly, leading the boarding party himself, alongside roughly a dozen of his remaining crew, a decision that, in hindsight, looks almost recklessly confident, but which made perfect sense given what he could actually see from his own deck. A sloop that had just absorbed a devastating broadside, showing no visible resistance, floating within easy reach. As Blackbeard's men clamber over Jane's rail, Maynard gives the signal, and you come up out of the hold into daylight that feels blinding after minutes in the dark, weapon already raised, alongside every other man who'd been packed below with you. What follows isn't a battle in any orderly sense. It's close-quarters chaos, pistols fired at a range of feet rather than yards, cutlasses swinging in a space too cramped for anything resembling formation, men grappling hand-to-hand on a deck slick with blood from the earlier broadside. You see Blackbeard directly, for the only time in this entire story, in the middle of that chaos. A tall, broad man, his famous beard matted and wild, moving through the fight with what witnesses later described as genuinely alarming physical strength for a man who must, by 1718, have been well into his 30s or 40s. Maynard himself engages him directly, and according to accounts given afterward, the two exchange pistol fire at close range before their weapons empty and the fight turns to blades. Maynard's cutlass reportedly snaps or bends in the exchange, leaving him badly exposed for a moment that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended the fight in Blackbeard's favour. What saves him, according to the same accounts, is one of his own crewmen stepping in with a slashing blow across the back of Blackbeard's neck, buying Maynard the half-second he needs to recover. Elsewhere on the crowded deck, a crewman named Caesar is fighting too, and his part in this story is one of the more sobering, semi-legendary details attached to the battle. Caesar, a black crewman serving aboard Blackbeard's adventure, had, according to multiple accounts filtered again through the same dramatized second-hand sources that require real caution, been stationed near the ship's powder magazine that morning with standing orders to blow the vessel apart entirely, killing everyone aboard including himself, rather than allow the crew to be captured. Whether or not that order was ever given exactly as described, court records confirm a man named Caesar was among the pirate crew captured after the battle, and later stood trial in Williamsburg alongside the other survivors. A detail that, whatever its exact origin, was widely believed and taken seriously enough at the time to shape how the fight itself was remembered by the men who lived through it. What happens over the next several minutes is the part of this story that's hardest to pin down with real precision, because so much of what survives comes filtered through Johnson's dramatized 1724 account rather than sober courtroom testimony, and the specific numbers attached to it should be read as legend rather than documented fact. That account claims Blackbeard absorbed something in the range of 5 pistol shots and more than 20 separate sword wounds before finally collapsing, a level of physical punishment so extreme that even contemporaries treated it as remarkable rather than routine, which is exactly why it's worth flagging as embellished rather than simply repeating it as established history. What multiple, more independently corroborated sources do agree on, with considerably less room for doubt, is that Edward Teach died on Jane's deck that morning, in hand-to-hand combat rather than from a distant cannon shot, cut down by a crew of Royal Navy volunteers fighting at a range close enough to see each other's faces. Around a third of Maynard's own party had already been killed or wounded by that point in the engagement. This was, whatever else it was, a genuinely costly fight for the men who won it, not the clean, one-sided victory it's often remembered as. Once Blackbeard fell, the fight didn't so much end as collapse. The remaining pirates aboard Jane, seeing their captain dead, either surrendered outright or fled below, and Maynard's surviving men, exhausted, bleeding, and standing on a deck now considerably more crowded with bodies than it had been an hour earlier, secured what remained of the adventure's crew. The wounded on both sides are gathered where they fell, and there's a strange, unspoken pause in the immediate aftermath, the kind of silence that follows any sudden violence once the adrenaline that made it possible starts to drain away. You help carry 2 of your own wounded below, men you'd hauled cannon alongside only days earlier, and you find yourself checking, without quite meaning to, whether Josiah Fane made it through the broadside on Ranger, a question this story will come back to properly once the trials that follow finally sort out who survived and who didn't. What Maynard did next is the detail that turns this from a battle into the specific, grim image most people actually associate with Blackbeard's death. He ordered Blackbeard's head severed from his body and hung from Jane's bowsprit, a grim but practical decision rather than an act of gratuitous cruelty. Reward money required proof, and a severed, recognizable head made a considerably more convincing exhibit for Spotswood and the Virginia Assembly than a written report ever could. Blackbeard's body, according to the same accounts, was thrown overboard into Ocracoke Inlet. The legend that followed almost immediately, that the headless body swam several times around the sloop before finally sinking, as though refusing to accept its own death, is exactly the kind of folklore this project treats with appropriate skepticism. Dramatic, widely repeated, and entirely undocumented by anyone who could have actually witnessed it from a position to know for certain. It's a story people wanted to be true, about a man whose entire career had already blurred the line between fact and performance. And that desire alone tells you something about how thoroughly Blackbeard's legend had outgrown Blackbeard the man, even in the very hour of his death. The crew Blackbeard actually had with him that final morning numbered somewhere between 18 and 25 men by most estimates, a startlingly small force compared to the flotilla that had once held Charleston hostage, and worth remembering precisely because it underscores how thoroughly the operation had already shrunk since Topsail Inlet, months before Maynard ever arrived. Some of those men fought and died alongside their captain. Others, seeing the fight turn against them once Blackbeard fell, threw down their weapons and begged for quarter, a request Maynard's exhausted, furious men were, by most accounts, inclined to grant, whatever the temptation toward vengeance might have been in the moment. Securing prisoners after a fight this chaotic and personal wasn't a simple matter of tying wrists. Several of the surviving pirates were wounded badly enough that securing them meant, in practice, keeping them alive long enough to answer for their crimes in a Virginia courtroom rather than dying quietly of neglect on Jane's blood-soaked deck. The journey back north wasn't quick, and it wasn't comfortable for anyone aboard. Wounded men from both sloops needed ongoing care that nobody aboard was especially well equipped to provide. Ranger's own surgeon, if she carried one at all, would have been overwhelmed by casualties from the initial broadside alone, let alone the additional wounds from the boarding fight that followed. Blackbeard's severed head, preserved as best the circumstances allowed for the journey north, remained lashed to Jane's bowsprit for the duration of the voyage, a grim, practical necessity rather than a lingering act of theatre. Proof of this kind needed to survive the trip intact if Spotswood's promised reward money was ever going to actually materialize for the men who'd earned it. By the time the sloops finally made port back in Virginia waters, word of what had happened at Ocracoke had already begun outpacing them, carried by whatever faster vessels or messengers had managed to reach the mainland first. What awaited Maynard and his surviving crew wasn't quite the triumphant welcome the legend prefers, either. A genuine reckoning over reward money, jurisdiction, and the human cost of the entire operation was only just beginning, and it would occupy colonial courts and correspondence for years to come. You think, more than once during that long, slow sail north, about the letter still folded into your coat, Josiah's letter, written the night before departure just in case. Somewhere in the chaos of the broadside and the boarding fight, you'd lost track of exactly who from Ranger survived and who didn't. And it isn't until the sloops finally make port that you learn Josiah is among the wounded rather than the dead, a pistol ball having caught him in the shoulder during the initial exchange rather than anywhere more final. You return the letter to him unopened on the dock at Kecoughtan, and he laughs, a little unsteadily, and says he supposes he'll have to write his brother a considerably more interesting one now instead. It's a small, quiet moment of relief in a story that hasn't offered many of them, and it's worth holding on to precisely because so few of the men involved in this operation, on either side, got an ending anywhere near that gentle. Looking back at the whole engagement afterward, what strikes most historians studying it isn't how one-sided the fight was, but how narrowly it could have gone the other way. Had Blackbeard's initial broadside caught Jane rather than Ranger at that critical angle, Maynard's own sloop might have been the one gutted before the boarding ruse ever had a chance to work, and this story might instead be remembered as the humiliating failure of an unauthorized Virginia expedition rather than the decisive end of Blackbeard's career. Had the sloops not worked free of the sandbar on the second attempt, the whole operation might have ended with Maynard's men picked off at leisure from a stationary target, unable to maneuver at all. Margins this narrow rarely survive in the popular retelling of any historical battle, which tends to flatten a chaotic, uncertain fight into an inevitability once the winning side is already known. It wasn't inevitable, it was close, costly, and decided as much by luck and improvisation as by any advantage either side actually held going in. That reckoning, and the fates of the men who survived to face it, is where this story turns next. Blackbeard was dead within minutes of that boarding, but the argument over what his death actually meant, legally, financially, and for the men who'd survived him, would drag on for years after his head stopped swinging from Jane's bowsprit. Israel Hands was not aboard the Adventure on the morning Blackbeard died, and that single accident of timing is very likely the only reason he lived long enough to become one of the most important witnesses in the entire affair. Some months earlier, the exact date is disputed, though most accounts place it sometime in the autumn of 1718, during the crew's uneasy period at anchor near Ocracoke, Hands had been shot in the knee by Blackbeard himself, during what multiple later accounts describe as a drunken, deliberately staged incident rather than an accident. The story, as it's usually told, involves Blackbeard extinguishing candles below deck, drawing 2 pistols under the table, and firing at his own men without warning simply to, in his own supposed later explanation, remind his crew who they were dealing with. A piece of dialogue that, like so much else attached to Blackbeard, comes down through Johnson's dramatized account and should be read as legend rather than verified quotation. What's better supported is the outcome. Hans was seriously wounded, left permanently lamed, and was ashore recovering, away from the adventure, when Maynard's sloops arrived at Ocracoke. Whatever Blackbeard's actual reasoning that night, the practical result was that his own quartermaster spent the single most important morning of the entire operation, nowhere near the fight, nursing a wound his own captain had given him. Hans survived the battle he wasn't present for and was subsequently captured, along with several other crew members who'd similarly been left ashore or aboard prize vessels rather than on the adventure itself that morning. He was, along with roughly a dozen other surviving pirates, transported to Williamsburg, Virginia, to stand trial, itself a jurisdictionally awkward fact worth noting, since the men had been captured in North Carolina waters and were being tried under Virginia's colonial court rather than North Carolina's, a detail that fed directly into the growing dispute between the two colonies over whether Spotswood's entire expedition had been legal in the first place. The trials themselves took place in March of 1719, roughly 4 months after the battle, held before a vice-admiralty court convened specifically for the purpose in Williamsburg. The proceedings moved quickly by modern standards, and the outcome for most of the defendants was grim and swift. The majority were convicted of piracy and hanged, a sentence carried out publicly as a deterrent to anyone else considering the same trade. Caesar, the crewman who'd allegedly been stationed at the Adventure's powder magazine, stood among those tried, and while the full detail of his individual case is thinner in the surviving record than most historians would like, court documentation confirms he was among the defendants convicted and executed, alongside the majority of his former crewmates. A grim end for a man whose most dramatic moment, whether legend or fact, had been a standing order to end his own life rather than surrender it. This is the part of the story that tends to get skipped in the celebratory version of events. Blackbeard's death wasn't the end of the human cost. A dozen more men, most of them considerably less famous and considerably more replaceable in the historical record, died on the strength of the same expedition, and their names survive today mostly as a list in a colonial court record, rather than as individuals anyone bothered to remember with much detail. Israel Hands did not hang, and the reason he didn't is precisely why he matters so much to this story. In exchange for his testimony, detailed, specific accounts of the operation Blackbeard had run out of Bath, the goods sold through Tobias Knight's customs office, the nature of his relationship with Governor Eden, Hands received a pardon. He turned king's evidence, as the legal phrase went, becoming the single most valuable witness colonial authorities had against the corrupt officials who'd protected Blackbeard for the better part of a year. His testimony described, in specific enough detail that it held up against Knight's own denials, the pattern of goods moving from captured prizes into Knight's storehouse, and the paperwork Knight had signed to disguise their origin. It's worth sitting with the irony here. The pirate, crippled by his own captain's cruelty, became, months later, the man whose testimony did more damage to that captain's protectors than anyone else involved in the entire affair. Whatever else you make of Israel Hands, his survival wasn't luck alone. It was a permanently ruined knee that kept him off the adventure on the one morning that mattered most, followed by a decision to trade information for his life rather than protect a dead captain's reputation. That testimony landed hardest on Tobias Knight. Investigators, acting partly on Hans's account and partly on physical evidence recovered from Knight's own property, built a case detailed enough that Knight was formally charged and brought before North Carolina's own governing council to answer for his role in laundering Blackbeard's plunder. He mounted a defense, denying direct knowledge of the goods' piratical origin and insisting the sugar and other cargo found on his property had been legitimately purchased through normal trade. a defense that grew increasingly difficult to sustain against witness testimony describing personal meetings between Knight and Blackbeard, and against the sheer awkwardness of a customs collector somehow failing to notice that the merchant selling him goods was the most recognizable pirate on the Atlantic coast. Knight died not long after the proceedings against him began, from illness, according to most accounts, rather than execution, which meant the full legal reckoning against him never reached a final, formal verdict. There's something almost anticlimactic about that ending, after everything the evidence against him suggested. A man whose corruption helped sustain one of the era's most notorious pirate operations simply ran out of time before the court could finish deciding what to do with him. History, in his case, delivered a verdict of its own regardless. His name survives almost exclusively as a case study in colonial corruption, remembered not for anything he built, but for what he was caught hiding. Governor Charles Eden fared considerably better, in the narrow legal sense, and it's worth being honest about how unsatisfying that outcome is. He faced no formal criminal charges connected to his role in pardoning, protecting, and quietly profiting from Blackbeard's operation. He remained governor of North Carolina until his death from natural causes in 1722, several years after the whole affair had concluded, his reputation dented, but his position never seriously threatened. Whether that reflects genuine innocence, insufficient evidence, or simply the practical reality that a sitting colonial governor was nearly untouchable compared to his subordinate customs officer, is a question historians still argue over, and the honest answer, again, is that the surviving record doesn't resolve it cleanly. Power, in this story, as in most others from the era, proved considerably more effective armor than a naval cutlass ever was. The dispute that outlasted almost everyone involved, stretching on in colonial correspondence for years after Blackbeard's death, was the one between Virginia and North Carolina over the legality of Spotswood's entire expedition in the first place. North Carolina's government, understandably furious that an armed force from a neighboring colony had crossed into their territory, captured and executed men there, and seized goods and property without any formal request or authorization from Eden's own administration, filed protests that worked their way slowly up through colonial channels toward London. Some of Spotswood's own actions during and after the expedition, including his handling of prize money and goods seized from the pirates, a portion of which he was accused of claiming for himself well beyond what the Reward Act technically authorized, became targets of formal legal challenge, with affected parties pursuing habeas corpus appeals and property disputes that dragged on for years, some reportedly still unresolved by the time Spotswood's own tenure as lieutenant governor ended in 1722. He never faced serious punishment for any of it. His reputation as the governor who'd finally rid the Atlantic coast of Blackbeard proved durable enough to survive years of messy, ongoing legal controversy about exactly how that victory had been achieved and exactly who'd profited from it afterward. Here's the uncomfortable thesis this whole chapter has been building toward, and it's worth stating plainly rather than leaving it implied. The men who paid the steepest price for Blackbeard's death weren't the powerful ones. Eden kept his governorship, Spotswood kept his reputation, and, by most accounts, a fair amount of prize money besides. Knight died of illness rather than the noose, his full reckoning cut short by mortality rather than justice. It was Israel Hands, permanently lamed by his own captain's cruelty, and a dozen anonymous crewmen who never got Hands's chance to trade testimony for a pardon, who bore the actual, physical cost of everything that had happened at Bath and at Ocracoke. History remembers the head on the bowsprit. It remembers considerably less well the dozen men hanged in Williamsburg a few months later, whose names survive mostly as a list, or the wounded, crippled sailor who lived only because he happened to be somewhere else on the one morning it mattered most. The Vice Admiralty Court convened in Williamsburg for the March 1719 proceedings wasn't an ordinary criminal court in the modern sense, and understanding its particular shape explains something about how quickly the trials moved. Piracy cases fell under maritime law rather than the colony's regular civil courts, tried before a panel of appointed commissioners rather than a conventional jury of peers, a structure designed specifically to move maritime crimes through the legal system faster than an ordinary felony trial might allow. Speed served a deterrent purpose as much as a judicial one. Colonial authorities wanted word of swift public justice to travel back down the coast to any pirate crew still weighing whether a royal pardon was worth taking seriously. The defendants, Israel Hands and Caesar included, would have stood before this panel over the course of a few concentrated days, rather than the drawn-out proceedings a modern court might require, with evidence presented, testimony heard, and verdicts rendered in a process built for efficiency far more than for the kind of exhaustive deliberation later legal systems would come to expect. One detail from the aftermath rarely makes it into the popular telling, and it's worth including here precisely because it's so unglamorous. Blackbeard's severed head, once it reached Virginia, was reportedly displayed for a time on a pole near the mouth of the Hampton River, at a site that would come to be informally known, for generations afterward, as Blackbeard's Point. It's a small, grim historical footnote, but a genuinely documented one, distinct from the far more embellished legends that grew up around his death. A public display meant less for spectacle than for proof, allowing any doubters among the Virginia public and the Assembly considering Spotswood's reward claims to see for themselves that the most feared pirate on the coast was, unambiguously, no longer a threat to anyone. Stepping back from the individual fates for a moment, it's worth placing the whole Ocracoke affair within the broader arc of what historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy. A relatively brief window running roughly from the 1690s through the early 1720s, during which conditions across the Atlantic and Caribbean, the end of one major European war leaving thousands of trained sailors suddenly unemployed, weak colonial enforcement, and lucrative shipping lanes largely undefended, allowed piracy to flourish on a scale rarely matched before or since. Blackbeard's death in 1718, alongside Woodes Rogers's crackdown in the Bahamas that same year, and a string of aggressive prosecutions that followed over the next several years, marks one of the clearer turning points in that era's slow, uneven decline. He wasn't the last major pirate captain to die violently at the hands of colonial authorities, but his death, given how thoroughly it was documented and publicized at the time, became one of the defining symbolic moments historians point to when explaining why the Golden Age's window eventually closed. Spotswood's own reward claims, once the Assembly's act was finally squared against the actual expedition's costs, took considerably longer to settle than anyone directly involved would have preferred, tangled up in exactly the kind of bureaucratic aftermath that never makes it into the exciting version of a pirate story. Disputes over who was owed what, out of a reward structure that hadn't technically existed in ratified form until after the fighting was already over, dragged through Virginia's colonial administration for months, with individual sailors like the ones aboard Ranger and Jane waiting considerably longer than £100 sterling should ever have taken to actually reach the men who'd bled for it. It's a small, bureaucratic footnote to a dramatic story, and also, in its own quiet way, one of the more relatable details in the entire affair. Even a genuinely historic victory, it turns out, still came with an infuriating amount of paperwork before anybody actually got paid. Israel Hands's life after the pardon fades from the documentary record almost as quickly as it entered it, which is its own quiet kind of ending. A handful of later, largely unverifiable traditions claim he lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity in London, reduced to begging by his ruined knee, though the evidence for this specific fate is thin enough that it belongs more properly alongside the other legends this story has flagged along the way than among its documented facts. What's certain is only the shape of the trade he made, testimony for survival, a former quartermaster's detailed knowledge of a corrupt system, exchanged for a pardon considerably more genuine in its practical effect than the one Blackbeard himself had accepted and quietly broken 5 months earlier. It's a strange, almost mirror-image ending to the story that began with his own captain shooting him under a table for no better reason than reminding a crew who held power over them. The wounded man, in the end, outliving and outmaneuvering the one who'd wounded him. What happened to the adventure, to the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, still buried off Beaufort Inlet, and to the legend that grew up around all of it in the centuries since? That's where this story finally comes full circle, back to the ship that started everything, and to a discovery, decades after every single person in this chapter had died, that would finally let historians separate some of the legend from the record. Nobody expected to find anything at all on the morning of November the 21st, 1996, which, if you're keeping track of dates, was almost exactly 278 years to the day after Blackbeard's own final battle at Ocracoke, a coincidence nobody involved in the search had specifically planned for, and which several team members later admitted gave them genuine chills once somebody worked out the math. By 1996, a private survey company called Intersal Inc. had already spent the better part of a decade searching the waters off North Carolina's coast, funded partly by treasure salvage ambitions and partly by a genuine, if commercially motivated, interest in maritime archaeology. Earlier searches had turned up little beyond modern debris and natural rock formations, the kind of quiet, repeated disappointment that tends to wear the excitement out of any long search well before it produces results, if it ever does. The team had permits, patience, and a working theory about roughly where Blackbeard's flagship ought to have gone down near Topsail, now Beaufort, Inlet, based on colonial-era accounts of the wreck's location. What they didn't have, until that particular November morning, was anything resembling proof. You're aboard a small research vessel a little over a mile off Beaufort Inlet, and the water beneath you is the kind of murky, sediment-choked green that makes underwater visibility a genuine liability rather than a helpful tool. You're relying on magnetometer readings and sonar returns considerably more than your own eyes, scanning for the metallic signature of iron ballast or cannon buried under centuries of shifting sand. By this particular morning, the excitement of the search has worn down into something closer to routine. You've followed dozens of promising sonar anomalies before. That turned out to be nothing more interesting than modern debris. This one, designated on the survey charts as Site 31CR314, doesn't initially look any different. Here's the strange contrast worth sitting with for a moment. 278 years earlier, a crew of desperate men worked frantically to save a sinking, grounded ship in this exact stretch of water, cannon rolling loose across a listing deck, timbers groaning under a weight the hull was never designed to bear on a sandbar. Now, in 1996, a different crew works just as carefully, but in reverse, trying to locate, rather than save, the very same wreck, treating the same iron cannon that once represented Blackbeard's terrifying firepower as a precious, fragile historical artifact instead. The initial dive team finds cannon almost immediately upon investigating the site properly. Not one or two, but eventually more than 24 recovered over the following years of excavation, along with anchors, ballast stone, and a scattering of smaller artifacts embedded in sediment that had protected them, ironically, better than open air ever could have. The identification wasn't instant, and it shouldn't have been. Good archaeology moves slowly, and the team spent considerable time cross-referencing the wreck's location, the type and dating of the cannon recovered, and the layout of the ballast against everything documented about the Queen Anne's Revenge's known final resting place. One recovered bell, badly corroded but still legible enough for conservators to work with, offered a partial casting date consistent with the ship's known history, though even that detail, researchers were careful to note at the time, functioned as supporting evidence rather than a definitive signature. No single artifact recovered from the site carries the ship's name outright, since 18th century vessels rarely left behind anything as convenient as a signed nameplate. By 1997, North Carolina's own Department of Cultural Resources had taken over stewardship of the site, formally designating it as the presumed wreck of Blackbeard's flagship, a conclusion supported by strong circumstantial evidence rather than a single conclusive artifact. The dating of the cannon, the location matching historical accounts, the ballast configuration consistent with a converted slaving vessel of La Concorde's known size, and the sheer scale of the wreck all pointed the same direction, and over the following decades, ongoing excavation only strengthened the case rather than weakening it. It's worth being honest, in the spirit of everything else this story has tried to handle carefully. Some maritime historians continue to describe the identification as presumed rather than proven beyond all doubt, a reasonable scholarly caution given the absence of a single smoking gun artifact, even as the accumulated circumstantial case has grown difficult to seriously dispute. Among the artifacts eventually recovered, one small collection did more to humanize this story than almost anything else pulled from the sediment. A set of apothecary's tools, including a small brass mortar and pestle, syringes, and vials, believed to have belonged to the ship's surgeon. Physical, tangible evidence connecting directly back to that strange, specific ransom demand Blackbeard made during the Charleston blockade back in May of 1718, when an entire port city bent to a pirate's will, not for gold, but for medicine. Whatever illness had been moving through his crew that spring, badly enough to justify holding a colonial capital hostage over it, left behind these small brass and glass fragments as its only physical evidence, sitting in North Carolina sediment for nearly 3 centuries before anyone was around to understand what they were looking at. It's a strange, quiet kind of artifact to anchor a pirate legend around. Not a cutlass, not a coin, but a doctor's tools, and it does more to humanize the men who sailed that ship than any cannon ever could. The wreck's rediscovery didn't stay a purely academic matter for long. In the years since 1996, both Beaufort and Ocracoke have leaned steadily into their connection to Blackbeard's final months, with museums, historical markers, and small annual commemorations drawing visitors who want to stand somewhere close to where the actual events happened, rather than simply read about them from a distance. It's a modest, mostly respectful kind of legacy building, the sort that tends to grow up naturally around any well-documented historical site, and it stands in fairly stark contrast to the wilder, largely undocumented pirate folklore, buried treasure maps, ghostly lights over the Sound on foggy nights, that had already been circulating around this same stretch of coastline for 2 centuries before a single cannon was ever pulled from the sediment. The excavation of Site 31 CR 314 continues, slowly and carefully, even now, decades after that first November morning in 1996, conservators working artifact by artifact, cataloguing a wreck that spent nearly 3 centuries doing nothing but sitting quietly under sand, while the story of the man who'd sailed her calcified into something closer to myth than memory. What the site has ultimately confirmed, more than any single dramatic discovery, is something this whole story has been circling from its very first scene, that the Queen Anne's Revenge's loss back in June of 1718 wasn't some minor footnote on the road to Ocracoke. It was, quite plausibly, the beginning of the end, the moment Blackbeard chose a smaller, faster, more personally profitable operation over the sprawling flotilla that had once held an entire colonial capital hostage, and in doing so, unknowingly built the smaller, more vulnerable target that Robert Maynard's 57 volunteers would eventually catch and kill 5 months later. Recovering an artifact from 3 centuries of underwater burial, it turns out, is only the beginning of a much longer process, and one that rarely gets mentioned in the brief news segments that followed the initial discovery. Iron objects like cannon, pulled from a saltwater environment after 278 years, are often more rust and concretion than actual metal by the time they reach the surface, and exposing them to open air too quickly can cause centuries of careful preservation by sediment to collapse into flaking ruin within weeks. Conservators at North Carolina's dedicated lab instead use a slow process called electrolytic reduction, submerging each recovered cannon in a chemical bath and running a gentle electrical current through it for months, sometimes years, gradually drawing out embedded chloride salts that would otherwise continue corroding the metal indefinitely once exposed to air. It's patient, unglamorous laboratory work, about as far from cutlasses and gunpowder as this story ever travels, and it's precisely the kind of quiet, careful labor that actually determines whether 300 years of physical evidence survives long enough for anyone in the present day to learn anything from it at all. The site's ongoing excavation has, over the decades, also fed a very different kind of legacy than the strictly academic one. A modest but genuine tourism economy built around Blackbeard's final months, drawing visitors to Beaufort's Maritime Museum, to Ocracoke's own small collection of pirate-themed historical markers, and to Bath, which now leans, with a mixture of local pride and gentle self-awareness, into its brief, uncomfortable status as host to the most notorious business arrangement in early American colonial history. It's worth noting that this modern legacy sits in genuine tension with the more sobering layers of the story underneath it. The enslaved Africans carried aboard La Concorde, the men marooned at Topsail Inlet, the dozen anonymous crew hanged in Williamsburg, a tension most of these small museums and markers handle with more historical honesty today than the swashbuckling adventure stories of a century ago ever managed. There's a broader lesson in all of this for anyone who cares about how history actually gets assembled, one that reaches well beyond Blackbeard specifically. Shipwreck archaeology, by its nature, recovers the physical objects a period actually used, cannon, tools, ballast, the occasional surgeon's kit, rather than the stories people told about those objects afterward, and the two don't always agree. Johnson's 1724 General History gave the world Blackbeard's smoking beard, his 14 wives, his theatrical taunts across open water, and a great deal of that account has proven impossible to verify, and in places, actively contradicted by more sober documentary evidence. The wreck off Beaufort Inlet, by contrast, gave the world a small brass mortar and pestle, a scatter of corroding cannon, and very little drama at all. And yet it's the quieter, less exciting evidence that historians now trust considerably more than the version everyone actually grew up hearing. Every so often, the excavation team recovers something small enough to make the whole scale of the project briefly collapse down to something personal. A single glass bead, a fragment of a wine bottle, a scrap of fabric weave preserved against all odds in the anaerobic mud below the sediment line. None of these objects individually rewrites any part of the history you've just heard tonight. What they do, cumulatively, is something quieter and in some ways more valuable. They confirm, artifact by patient artifact, that the men who sailed and fought and died in this story were exactly that, men with wine bottles and buttons and ordinary belongings, rather than the flattened, larger-than-life legend that grew up in their place over 3 centuries of retelling. Somewhere in that sediment, still, is very likely a piece of Queen Anne's Revenge nobody has catalogued yet, waiting the same patient way the apothecary's mortar waited, for a diver with the right sonar reading and enough stubbornness to keep looking. It's worth noting, too, that the wreck site's rediscovery reopened, rather than closed, a number of scholarly debates that had sat largely dormant since the early 20th century, questions about the precise size of Blackbeard's crew at various points in 1718, about the ship's exact armament configuration, and about how closely the vessel's actual construction matched the second-hand descriptions colonial witnesses had given at the time. Archaeology, in this sense, rarely delivers the tidy, final answers popular imagination expects of it. More often it delivers better questions, grounded in physical evidence rather than second-hand legend, and leaves the harder work of interpretation to historians willing to sit with genuine uncertainty rather than force a clean story out of an incomplete record. That's a less satisfying note to end a pirate story on than a clean, confident answer would be, but it happens to be the honest one, and honesty has been the whole point of this retelling from the very first scene at Topsail Inlet onward. Here's the quiet, genuinely strange truth this whole story has been building toward, chapter by chapter, and it's worth saying plainly now that we've reached the end of it. The Royal Navy, in any conventional sense, never actually defeated Blackbeard at all. No warship ever fired on him. No broadside from a proper man-of-war ever touched his ship. What actually ended Edward Teach's career was a cascade of smaller, less glamorous failures. A flagship wrecked, deliberately or not, on his own sandbar, a crew he'd shrunk down to save himself money, a corrupt protection scheme in Bath that made him confident rather than careful, and finally, 2 stripped-down, borrowed sloops crewed by 57 underpaid volunteers willing to close the distance by hand when cannon fire alone couldn't finish the job. It's a considerably messier, more human story than the legend prefers, one built on bribery, jurisdictional overreach, a governor's personal ambition, and a lieutenant's willingness to play dead long enough to win. But it's the true one, buried under Carolina sand for nearly 300 years, waiting for a research vessel that almost didn't find it at all. Blackbeard's head is long gone now, and so is the bowsprit it hung from, and so is every single person who stood on that deck at Ocracoke on the morning of November the 22nd, 1718. Maynard, Hans, Eden, Spotswood, Knight, and all 57 nameless volunteers who sailed south not knowing whether they'd survive the week. What's left is a scatter of cannon under sediment off Beaufort Inlet, a small brass mortar and pestle that once treated whatever illness moved through a pirate crew 3 centuries ago, and, somewhere along a muddy street in what used to be Bath, perhaps the faint, untraceable echo of a tavern that a man named Henry Turnage might, if his luck finally held, have actually gotten to open. What's left, mostly, is a story that turns out to be considerably less about one terrifying man than about the quiet, unglamorous systems, corrupt officials, borrowed ships, a governor's ambition, a crippled sailor's testimony, that actually decide how history's most fearsome legends come apart. You're a long way from Ocracoke's cold water tonight, further still from a sandbar in the dark or a deck slick with blood. The lights are dim if you followed along earlier, and wherever that fan or that low hum is running in your room, it's a far gentler sound than wind through rigging ever really was. You're warm, you're dry, you're not waiting for a tide to free a grounded sloop, and nobody on this side of 300 years is coming to collect a bounty on your head. That apothecary's mortar is still sitting in North Carolina sediment right now, patient as it's been for centuries, and it isn't going anywhere tonight, and neither, for a little while longer, do you have to. You're warm, you're safe. Tonight, that's enough.